In the winter of 1636, in the taverns of Holland, a man could hand over the price of a fine canal house and receive in return a single flower bulb that would not even bloom until spring. Not the flower, just the bulb, just the promise of it. This is Tulip Mania, the frenzy that gripped the Dutch Republic in the 1630s, when the humble tulip, a flower with no scent, no fruit, no use but beauty, became one of the most expensive things in the known world. Prices doubled, then doubled again. Weavers and merchants poured their savings into bulbs they would never see, trading paper promises in smoky back rooms. And then, on a single day in February 1637, the buyers simply stopped coming. It is remembered as the first great financial bubble, a story of greed, madness, and ruin. But the real story is stranger and quieter than the legend. This is how Tulip Mania actually worked: the flower, the market, the crash, and the myth. The tulip was not Dutch. It came from the East, a wildflower of the mountains and steppes of Central Asia, prized for centuries in the gardens of the Ottoman Empire, where the sultans grew it by the thousand. In the middle of the 16th century, bulbs traveled west. An ambassador in Constantinople sent seeds and bulbs back to Vienna, and from there, the tulips spread across Europe, to Augsburg, to Antwerp, to Amsterdam. The man who truly rooted it in Dutch soil was a botanist named Carolus Clusius. In 1593, he took charge of the great botanical garden at Leiden University and planted his precious collection there. He discovered something crucial. The tulip, tough and strange, could survive the cold, wet climate of the Low Countries. By the spring of 1594, the first tulips were flowering in Holland. At first, they were the toys of scholars and the very rich, a rare and exotic marvel, guarded behind garden walls. No one yet imagined that this flower could be worth a fortune. What made a tulip valuable was not just rarity, it was the pattern. Most tulips were a single, solid color: plain red, plain yellow, plain white. But every so often, a bulb would produce something extraordinary: petals streaked and feathered with vivid flames of contrasting color, no two alike, as if painted by hand. These were the broken tulips, and collectors went wild for them. They gave them noble names and sorted them into ranks: the Couleren, the single colors, the Rosen, red or pink flames on white, the Violetten, purple on white, and rarest of all, the Bizarden, streaked on a deep base. Above them all stood one legendary bloom, the Semper Augustus, white with flames of deep carmine red climbing from a blue base. Only a handful existed, and their owner reportedly refused to sell at any price. What no one knew was the secret behind the beauty. The flames were caused by a virus carried between plants that broke the color and quietly weakened the bulb, so that the most beautiful tulips were also the hardest to reproduce. Scarcity built into the flower itself. To understand the mania, you have to understand the bulb. A tulip is not sold like a sack of grain. It grows on a slow, unforgiving clock. The flower blooms for barely a week in April or May. Then it dies back, and the bulb sleeps underground. Only in those dormant summer months, roughly June to September, can the bulb safely be lifted from the earth and moved and sold and planted somewhere new. A single fine bulb was precious partly because it grew so slowly. Each year, it might produce a few small offsets, tiny clones budding from its side, and it could take years to build a stock of a rare variety. So the rarest bulbs were weighed like gold, measured in tiny units called aces, fractions of a gram. And the heaviest, healthiest bulbs of the most beautiful varieties commanded the highest prices of all. A living thing, growing on nature's schedule, in a market that was about to lose its patience entirely. Here is the twist that turned a flower into a bubble. The bulbs could only be dug up and delivered in summer, but people wanted to trade all year round, especially through the long, idle winter. So the Dutch invented a solution. They stopped trading bulbs and started trading promises. Instead of handing over a bulb, a buyer and seller would sign a contract before a notary. A promise to deliver a named bulb at an agreed price when the season came. The bulb itself stayed in the ground. What changed hands was a slip of paper. This was the win handle, the win trade, because you were buying and selling nothing but air. And it happened not on any official exchange, but in the back rooms of taverns, in informal clubs, the traders called colleges. They bought and sold with chalk and slate and a ritual of bids, sealed each deal with a small payment of wine money, and drank on it. No cash down, no collateral, just signatures and confidence. A contract could be sold onto a second buyer, then a third, the price climbing each time, a bulb changing owners 5 times over a single winter and never once leaving the soil. And so, through the winter of 1636 into 1637, the prices climbed to something like delirium. A bulb bought in the autumn might be worth double by midwinter and double again by January. The rarest varieties reached staggering sums, the price of a merchant's house or 10 years' wages for a skilled craftsman for a single bulb still asleep in the ground. The legend says that everyone joined in, that chimney sweeps and maid servants and the lowest of the low threw their savings into tulips, dreaming of riches. The truth is narrower, but no less strange. The traders were mostly well-off merchants and skilled artisans, weavers, brewers, craftsmen with money to spare, men who knew each other, drinking and dealing in the same few towns. Haarlem was the beating heart of it, but the mood was unmistakable. People were paying impossible prices for paper claims on flowers, in the certain belief that someone else would pay more tomorrow. And for a while, someone always did. So what exactly did these prices mean? The stories that survive are almost unbelievable. A single rare bulb, it was said, might fetch 2,000 or 3,000 guilders, at a time when a skilled worker earned perhaps a few hundred guilders in an entire year. One famous, much-repeated tale lists the goods offered for a single bulb of a variety called the Viceroy. Wagon loads of wheat and rye, 4 fat oxen, 8 pigs, a dozen sheep, barrels of wine and beer, tons of butter and cheese, a bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver cup, a whole farmstead's worth of wealth for one flower bulb. Whether every such story is literally true, the shape of it is real. At the peak, the most coveted bulbs were priced like houses, like fortunes. The Semper Augustus, the crown jewel of them all, was valued at thousands of guilders a bulb. Grown men were signing away years of their lives for a promise of color that would last in bloom about a week. It ended the way bubbles always end, suddenly and without warning. In the first days of February 1637, in a routine bulb auction in the city of Haarlem, something went wrong. The auctioneer offered his lots, and no one bid. He lowered the price and lowered it again, and still no buyers came forward. Word spread through the taverns like cold water. The buyers were gone. And once everyone understood that the next buyer might not exist, no one wanted to be holding a contract for a flower worth a fortune. Prices didn't drift down. They fell off a cliff, collapsing to a fraction of their peak within days, and in some cases, to almost nothing. Suddenly, thousands of people were bound by contracts to buy bulbs at prices that no longer made any sense. Bulbs they could not sell, could not afford, and in most cases had never even seen. Within a week, growers in the towns were meeting in a panic, sending representatives to Amsterdam. The dream had turned, overnight, into a mountain of unpayable debt. Now came the hard question: who owed what to whom? A buyer had promised on paper to pay a fortune for a bulb. The seller wanted his money. The buyer couldn't and wouldn't pay. Multiply that by thousands of broken contracts, and you had chaos. The authorities at first did not want to touch it. This was gambling, they said, not honest trade, and gambling debts were the trader's own problem. But the mess was too big to ignore. Town by town, officials searched for a compromise. In Haarlem, months later, the city offered a settlement. A buyer could tear up his contract by paying just a small fraction of the agreed price, a few percent, to walk away. Some paid it, many paid nothing at all. The courts filled with tulip disputes that dragged on for years, and in the end, the great tangle of promises was mostly just let go. Contracts quietly abandoned, deals unwound, everyone agreeing more or less to pretend the madness had never happened. For centuries afterward, Tulip Mania was told as a tale of national ruin, of a whole country driven mad, fortunes destroyed, families beggared by a flower. Much of that came from a single popular book, written 200 years later, drawing on satirical pamphlets that had been written at the time to mock and moralize, not to report. Modern historians, digging through the actual records, found something more sober. The trade was real, and the prices were real, and the panic was real. But the ruin was not. Because the bulbs were rarely delivered and the money rarely actually changed hands, very few people were truly bankrupted. The Dutch economy barely flinched. It remained the richest in the world. What Tulip Mania really left behind was not poverty, but a story, a permanent warning, burned into memory about crowds and greed and the price of a promise. 400 years on, we still reach for it every time a market runs wild. The tulip, blooming for a week and worth a fortune for a winter.